Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Now, before we jump into the podcast, I want to give you a quick heads up that on May 14th, 2024, we are going to be launching a brand new resource called Lead Security. On May 14th, we're going to have a release party, so to speak. It's going to be a webinar with a lot of free giveaways, with a lot of information about what this thing is, Lead Security. Well, we believe deep down that your church should be inviting, and yet your church should be secure. And so we've created a master training as big, if not bigger, than anything we've ever released before. It is the most comprehensive resource on church security. We have a webinar registration in the show notes, both on every podcast that you would like that you listen to, and even on YouTube. We're going to be sending this out to everybody. We want you to register for the Lead Security webinar release. This whole entire master course, master training on how to have a healthy, volunteer-led security team at your church. You don't want to miss it. Join us and click in the show notes to join this webinar registration. Now, we'll jump into the podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Lead Ministry Podcast. Grateful that you guys are here. Have a special day today. Whether you know it or not, April is the Child Safety Awareness Month. That's right. There's children in our ministries, and we need to keep them safe. And so we're kicking off a little 4-week series about security and your church. And we're doing this for several reasons. Not only is it Child Safety Awareness Month, we're also, on my side of things, we're actually launching a brand new, humongous initiative. Very few people know about it. We're going to introduce that. It's going to be a brand new master training under the Lead Ministry kind of umbrella of resources. But this one's going to be different. It's going to be unique. It's going to be something that you've never seen before and that doesn't really exist as it relates to the church ministry world. Well, again, my name is Josh Denhart. Grateful that you're here. We do this podcast for several very important reasons. Number one, we want to help you to get organized. Number two, we want to help you stop the revolving door of volunteers. And number three, we want to make sure that you have all of the tools that you need to stay out of the ditch of burnout. That's one of my main goals. I think burnout is dangerous. I think it's almost an inevitability, but there are things that we can do that are within our power to make a big difference. Well, I'm very excited. I mentioned and just teased out a little bit that we have this brand new master training coming out. It's called Lead Security, and I got to introduce to you my friend Preston Hocker. Preston, grateful that you're here, buddy.
Hey, glad to be here.
Preston and I have been working for quite a while on this crazy initiative. Very, very, very grateful. Preston, before we get too far, just introduce yourself to the crowd just a little bit.
Well, my name is Preston Hocker. I've been a staff pastor for 20 years, doing everything from kids ministry to youth ministry, and I tell people I've done everything there is to do except for bookkeeping. You don't want me in that office. You don't want me there. But I've done everything, clean toilets, all, run the whole gambit.
And you preach on the regular.
Yeah, so I preach. I run our midweek service, our Wednesday night service.
Yes.
So I've been preaching. Really, I've been on some level. I've been preaching since I was about 16 years old.
Oh my word, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I had a great youth pastor who was not afraid to let kids fail, and I think that's great. Youth ministry was a great place to fail, and it's a safe place to fail. I think a lot of people are so terribly afraid of failure, and they're partially afraid of failure because they've never seen it done correctly. And so I started preaching and probably failed a bunch of times when I was 16.
Well, you're speaking into kind of the lead ministry rhythm of things. And what that is even though we're not going to go down the road of ministry multiplication today, that'd be a great episode for the future. But here's what I want to point out, that putting in the freshmen, right? Play the freshmen, right?
Yep.
Get them in the game, get them to feel the thrill of the field. That's another episode. We'll have you back. We'll talk about that. But really, we're having you on today because, as like I said, it's Child Safety Awareness Month. You and I we are at the precipice of a brand new release called Lead Security, because you're not only a pastor, you've not only done the gamut of things inside of the church, including being the lead security person at your church to lead a security team. You also have a unique background that really actually qualifies you in a way that it just sets you apart. So tell us about your professional security kind of credentials.
So outside of the church, I've got a security company. We cut our teeth on private investigation, executive protection, bounty hunting, all of those kinds of things. We also have some sites where we've got armed security officers protecting, multi-million dollar businesses. So I've got this unique set of skills where it's ministry, but then I've got security, and I wanted to kind of blend these things in order to give the church a clear picture of what security ought to look like within the body of Christ.
I love that. It's almost like, okay, this is going to be weird, but most people know that I have this thing called the Amazing Chemistry Show. And so in the background, if you're watching on YouTube, there is the periodic table on my wall. That's how big of a nerd I am. And so I took ministry and chemistry, blended them together, and I have this crazy thing called the Amazing Chemistry Show. But you are taking ministry and security, these two passions, and you're blending them together. And I just got to say, I think that's the plan of God. That God wants to take the things that we love, and he's like, hey, I know you love that. How about we beautifully exploit that love for the sake of the body? Can we do it? I think God gets excited. I get excited. So you are this unique security professional. You do know ministry, but you also know security. Well, we're going to jump in today and let everybody know this is kind of the inaugural announce that you and I have partnered together. We have been working like an obscene amount of hours and an obscene amount of work that started in 2023. I mean, it's crazy how much work we're putting into this thing, Lead Security. It's going to be a full length. It's going to be a beyond full length master training. It's the biggest offering that I've ever put out. It does, in terms of its volume and its comprehensiveness, it almost rivals the Lead Volunteers course that I put out. So Lead Security.
Yeah. I'm really excited about it. This is not a project that we just kind of threw together. We didn't just put some pieces together and say, "Oh, that's good enough." No, it's been a labor, but it's been very worth it, and I'm really excited. I deeply believe that there will be some lives that are rescued.
Yep.
Some people, some pain that otherwise would have come to pass, but some pain that will be
mitigated. It'll be mitigated.
Because the church is being empowered through what we're doing with Lead Security. Yeah,
I got to tell you, man, true story. I don't have the camera to zoom in, but I when you were saying that, I got goosebumps. Because I do believe that the work we're doing is good. We're not going to dive into all of what Lead Security is. However, I do want to announce that you and I are launching a brand new podcast called the Lead Security Podcast. It's actually called the Lead Church Security Podcast. And it's going to be a similar format that we have here, but it's going to be focused exclusively on leading security in a church context. We'll talk more about that. We're not going to deal with that too much today. Here's the topic for today. It's called Guarding the Flock, the Imperative of Church Security. So this is kind of a general overview of church security. Again, the title today is Guarding the Flock, the imperative of church security. So as everybody knows who's a regular listener, and if you're not a regular listener, you just have to understand that we're understanding that you may be watching this on YouTube, but you may be listening to this as you're exercising or that you're driving. So we want to create what I call mental scaffolding. Three big buckets for the listeners, Preston. So the bucket number 1 is we're going to define it. Bucket number 2, we're going to develop it. And bucket number 3, we're going to call people to action and we're going to do something about it. So bucket number 1, what is church security? So we're defining this. Well, I have to say, you've trained me, right? Like I am your Padawan learner in this little endeavor here. And you trained me. Josh, guess what? Church security is way bigger than an armed gunman. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so that's what I've noticed. Before we ever started down this path, I was looking into church security courses online. And most of what I find is really people are really wanting to dive into active shooter or active attacker types of scenarios, and which I'm all about, preparing for the worst cases.
And by the way, hang on real quick. Let's point out real quick. An armed gunman in a church, like 40 years ago, was completely unheard of.
Yeah.
So it exists and it happens. However, it is a rarity, though we never want it to happen. So it exists, but okay, help us out.
Well, I think, it exists. Just speaking to that point of, 40 years ago, it didn't really happen, right? But I remember when I was like even a teenager, like I was in youth group, and the thought of somebody like saying a bad word in church was outlandish. You don't say that. You don't. Or I remember people saying things like, "Don't lie, you're in church." But now,
wow.
But now, like people have or at least certain people have a complete disregard for what we lovingly call the house of God.
Yeah.
And so, church security has to do with just mitigating risk.
Yes, all around.
All risks. Looking at possible risks.
Okay.
And teaching people how to mitigate those risks.
How to mitigate all risks. So let's just run through real quick what church security includes. And I'm just going to throw out a few. We can both speak to them. Church security involves an elderly person falling.
Right. It's a real risk. And I know we've had it. I've been on staff at my church for 20 years. And I know of a number of times where elderly people fall. It just is what they do.
Yes.
Funny story. My father-in-law, he works in what we call our compassion center, our food bank.
Yes.
And years ago, he had cancer on his spine. Thank God. He was brought through it. I mean, he had a grapefruit-sized tumor that was wrapped around his spine. Not good. But God's brought him through it. And he walks with a cane. And, sometimes his leg will kind of give out.
Sure.
And he was working in our food bank, what we call the compassion center. And we heard a kind of a sound coming from the compassion center. I should also note that he's about 5'2", not a very tall man. So it was around Thanksgiving time, and he was, make the long story short, he was digging, trying to get a frozen turkey out. To give to somebody.
Being taken out by a frozen turkey.
Got taken out by the frozen turkey. He actually fell into the deep freezer.
And he's 5'2", so he's probably fit.
And his legs don't work very well. He had to get out. It was funny as his son-in-law.
Well, that's actually kind of hilarious. It's elderly people fall, and sometimes they're going to fall into the church freezer.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, but it's not funny because sometimes people do fall and they really genuinely get hurt. And there are people who fall and sometimes never recover because of those falls.
Okay.
So
now I got to say,
church. Yep. Go ahead.
I got to say, here I was out in Oregon doing the Amazing Chemistry show. And all of a sudden this lady tripped and she fell down some the entry stairs to the church, and she didn't block her fall by her hands. She fell directly, squarely on her face. I've never seen anything quite like it. The amount of blood that took place was obscene. Yeah. But I tell you that their church was not prepared for such an event. Yeah. And it threw everything into chaos. And it simply didn't need to be, because they could have had a predetermined, set in stone plan. Okay, so elderly people fall. However, a fire could start in the kitchen, and we're likely going to blame it on the youth group. Probably.
Everything's the youth group's fault.
Yes.
But yeah, if you have a kitchen at your church, the likelihood of a kitchen fire is high, especially because people don't treat the church kitchen like their own kitchen. They imagine that there's some cleanup fairy that's going to come behind them and like clean up all the grease. And they imagine somebody is going to make sure all of that space is taken care of, and it just isn't so.
And so we have to have plans in place for mitigating that loss. Okay, stick with me. We're going to go fast through these. Cyber attacks. They exist.
Lots of them. Very prevalent.
And the reason why cyber attacks exist is because the church is typically like this absolutely sitting duck in the middle. They're like, this'll be easy, right? Yep. And so we as church leaders need to be aware of that. So, okay, another one, domestic abuse situations. You teed me up to this one a long time ago where you said it's not an active attacker with an assault rifle. The majority of things we deal with is a domestic abuse situation or a custody issue.
Yep.
And just speak super, super briefly about this.
Well, especially the custody issue. I've spent a lot of my time in ministry actually in kids' church. And just because the man is daddy.
Yep.
And the kid loves daddy doesn't necessarily mean that the kid is legally allowed to go with daddy. So like we have to have some policies and procedures in place to make sure kids are where they're supposed to be. From the private investigation side of my background, so one of our most prominent cases was finding a child who was kidnapped by his mother. So like and she had stolen her kid and kept her son away from the father for 6 months. Okay. And so was she mom? Yes, but she didn't have legal rights. So those are like,
and it's a really easy thing. It's a very easy thing in a children's ministry context to go, oh yes, hey, whatever. So we have to deal with those things. Another one is an active attacker. Now it doesn't have to just be a gunman. You've trained me about this. Speak briefly to this.
Well, if all we do is train for an active gunman or an active shooter, what we're training ourselves to do is respond to lethal force.
Right.
Problem is what if the person who is attacking isn't using lethal force, but we've only been trained to respond to lethal force with lethal force? What could end up happening is somebody who is having a mental breakdown, a mental episode in the lobby of the church, and he's swinging his belt around and whipping people. He ends up getting fatally injured by one of your security officers, security team members.
Who's a volunteer.
Who is a volunteer, who thinks he's doing the right thing. But then in the end, he spends most of his life in jail because he had only been trained to respond to an active shooter, not to an active attacker who might not be using lethal force.
Okay, so here's the funny thing. This hole goes so deep. Like
it sure does.
It gets extremely complex, extremely fast. And I will guarantee that a lot of our listeners are like, dang, I didn't think through a handful of these. And here's another one. Well-organized protesters. That's a real issue.
Yeah. Especially with elections coming up, we're putting this out in 2024. We can expect both legal and non-legal or illegal protests to occur. And the church has to know rights. We have to know what defines a legal protest, what defines an illegal protest, and how do you manage both of them? Because both of them need to be managed.
And they have different pathways through which they're going to be, watch this, graciously managed in a godly way. Because we can manage this and get plastered all over social media and YouTube because the protesters were videotaping our absolutely less than godly approach, or we can actually do this with a godly approach. Now, I have to say, I don't want to make this a plug necessarily for lead security, but the reality exists that we have created a resource that not only addresses every one of the things that we just talked about: elderly person falls, fires, cybersecurity, domestic abuse, active attacker, custody issues, and this well-organized protester. We have like scripts that are already pre-produced and ready to go. If this is an illegal protesting thing, or if it is a legal protesting thing, here's the pathway that you follow, and here is actually word for word what you could say to stay out of hot water. So we'll get into the more of the details in the insanity of the resource that we've created, because it is big. But I gotta say, bottom line, if there was a power statement to be made right now, it is church security must be comprehensive.
Yeah, we can't afford to not have church security. I was talking to a buddy, a real close friend of mine. I've known him since, I don't know, we were 5 or 6 years old. And I was talking about church security and the resources that we're making available through lead security. And he was like, man, we don't even have a security team. And which to me, that's like, what? What do you mean you don't have a security team? I was, however, able to respond, hey, man, listen, lesson number 7, when this thing launches, and you're able to get your hands on this course, lesson number 7 is all about building your team. So we're going to get you through. We're going to get it doesn't matter if you don't have a team yet. We'll build it up. We'll get you taken care of. But yeah, church security needs to be comprehensive. It can't just be like focused on one thing or another thing. It has to. That's why this course grew so much. Yeah, it because did. I just kept feeling like the sentence needed more, I needed to add more content. So that's how we got where we're at.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. It is very comprehensive. And so here's the thing though. Now we kind of defined what church security is and how it covers a whole heck of a lot more than any of us ever want to know. And a lot of different extraneous circumstances. That's great. So what is church security? Well, it's more than we initially think. But now part 2 of this podcast is, let's develop this. Let's go a little bit deeper. And we've defined it, but now as we go deeper, how would your church be graded? As in, are you going to get an A or are you going to get a D? And I don't know about you, but I don't think as a shepherd, getting a D is that which we want to do as shepherds. Listen, so yeah, how are you going to be graded?
A D just is unacceptable.
Right.
A D should be unacceptable. When somebody comes to our place of worship, I believe we take responsibility for them.
I agree.
At least on some level, we take responsibility for them. We take responsibility for their safety. We take responsibility for their security. I believe, especially as somebody who's in the security industry, I'm ruined. I have a very difficult time going to like public places and not having my head on a swivel.
Yep. In other words, and you've rubbed off on me the idea that I have a new that I have a new set of goggles, that I'm actually observing my surroundings, and I just have a slightly different view. Because the bottom line is, what we need is to have some level of an evaluation, an evaluative tool to say, okay, how can I get a security snapshot?
So how can you get a security snapshot is, one thing that we're doing with lead security is I've got one of my executives with my company who he's former Homeland Security.
Yes.
I mean, his resume is his resume is so ridiculous, but he's developing an evaluation checklist that our team will be able to go on site and talk about some of these things that we're talking about right now, but do it in a professional manner. If you don't have the capability to do that, if you want to get a good idea of where your church is going to land, walk around your facility, walk in your facility, be honest, don't have an ego, and get really honest about how safe your facility is. Get really honest about if you have procedures and policies in place to mitigate risk, or when something bad happens, do you have policies and procedures to handle that event?
Well, we are putting together that comprehensive resource, but for the remainder of this episode and then the next 2 episodes, I want to talk about where the greatest vulnerability lies in the church. As in, where is some of our biggest exposure and our biggest fears? And guess what? It's child safety.
Yeah, I hadn't even seen that slide yet, but I knew what it needed to be.
Yes,
what it ought to be is children, and that's one of the issues that we find a lot in church security. Is you get a guy that wants to be a bodyguard really bad, and he wants to stand by the lead pastor and make sure the lead pastor is taken care of. I'm sorry, but Pastor Bill, nobody is likely trying to assassinate Pastor Bill. Very rare. Very rare. What people are trying to do is victimize kids.
That's exactly right.
I believe the enemy, meaning the devil, would love for church to be a place of trauma for children, because then that disconnects kids from the heart of the Father for a lifetime.
That's exactly right.
I think we have to protect kids.
Okay.
We have to put our focus on them.
It's a great place to start. We start with the most vulnerable. And so that leads us right now. Of course, the first step was, what is church security? The second one is, how would you grade yourself? And the next one is, oh my word, where do we begin? If you don't have anything in place, start with kids. And so
start with kids.
So the foundation of everything that we're talking about through lead security, and you introduced this to me, it's simple. The foundation is be an inviting church that is also secure. It can be both.
It can.
And this piece of being both is starting with how to have a plan for child safety. So we're going to go through this rather fast. We are going to unpack this more for the listeners on the next 2 episodes. We're going to go deep into background checks. However, that's where it starts.
Yeah.
It starts with background checks. And in terms of background checks, we're going to deal with this on the next episode, but there are good places to go and there are less good places to go. You will never be able to pull off background checks on your own as a church. If you're like, well, we'll just we got a police officer here and we'll call Officer Billy. It does not work that way. And so you need comprehensive background checks. And the one that we, recommend, and I used exclusively, and I started the child protection safety thing at our church, was Protect My Ministry. And I know that's what you've used for 20, as long as you've been in ministry.
That's what we've used. As far as I know, that's what we've used for the majority of my ministry.
Yes.
If not the totality of my ministry at 20 years.
So a really good start is background checks, but it can't end there. Another quick piece is simple volunteer team training, where you're like, hey, by the way, here's what we don't do, here's what we do, and we need you guys. Part of that training is the third one that I have right here is situational awareness. We're going to talk about this at a later time, but unpack briefly, what is this idea of situational awareness?
In short, it's just paying attention. It's paying attention to what's going on, paying attention to things that don't make sense or don't match. It's finding, you see the kids' preschool worksheet, and it's got a picture of a square and a circle and a triangle and a fire truck, and it says which one doesn't match, right? So finding the fire truck in a bunch of shapes, being able to locate that. But we can talk more on it at a later date, because
There's
There's
a lot
so much that goes into it, especially within the realm of church, because we don't want to be judgmental. We want people to be inviting. So how can we manage that?
Well, the interesting thing is part of that volunteer training is giving people an understanding of how they can have an eye for situational awareness. Okay, the next piece is a plan for child safety. Yes, it's background checks. Yes, it's volunteer training. Yes, it's situational awareness. But guess what? You have to prepare to have hard conversations.
Yeah,
they're rare. Listen, in my decade at the church, I had 4 hard conversations. And we are a church of 2,000, man. We did thousands of background checks. And so it's rare, but you can't avoid those hard conversations. Well, and the nice thing about Lead Security is we have all that stuff prepped for you. You're like, oh my word, I have no idea what I'm supposed to say. Click this button, download this resource. Okay. Now the last thing, a plan for child safety. There is a balance between being vigilant and being straight out paranoid.
Right. So I like to use this term of having an intelligent imagination. Right? Okay. Imagination has to do with making things up, and like kids have imaginations, and that's why they believe that their stuffed animal. I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and she has a little stuffed animal that is a triceratops, and it's called Softy is its name. And Softy, talks to her and like plays with her, and it's her friend. Well, she's 6. That makes sense. But what an intelligent imagination is it's when we take our imaginations and then put them into a context of reality. What is normal? What is something that could happen in the context of my church, my community, those kinds of things? And that kind of helps us stay away from paranoia. Just working from that framework.
And so being vigilant is that you're on top of your game. You're keeping your eyes aware. Being paranoid is thinking that there are, problems under every rock, and everybody that sneezes needs to be looked at skeptically. Not positive. Well, gang, this has been positive. This is just an intro. We are going to have this over the next number of weeks. It is, as I said, Child Safety Awareness Month. I think that was very apropos. Not to mention, we are releasing this new course. If you're taking anything away, number 1, your church needs to be secure. Number 2, I doubt, unless your church is an anomaly, your grade is probably not what it ought to be in America today.
Yeah.
And number 3, we're talking about where should you begin? Child safety. Bottom line, background checks are important, but they are not sufficient. It starts with background checks, but all of a sudden when you have a background check screening for everybody in there, you should not rest on your laurels and say, sweet, we are now a secure church. Guess what? Yeah. Having background checks, that does not mean that you get an A in the area of security.
Yeah. No, you hear the term like E for effort. Effort isn't good enough. If we have to decide, like background checks really mitigate liability with the church. And I think the church, we really need to decide, do we just want to mitigate liability or do we really want to keep our people safe? And I think most of us would love to keep our people safe. We just don't know how to do it. So we rest on background checks because that's the only thing that we know to do. But there's so much more that we can do. And you said like not every church, most churches, unless you're the anomaly, you're not going to be graded A. Listen, even my own church security team at my church, most days I wouldn't give them an A. But it's just what it comes down to is having this drive to be better, drive to serve families and serve kids, and just changing your perspective that we can keep people safe. We can make a difference.
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, this is what we're going to be talking about over the next several episodes of the Lead Ministry podcast. Grateful that you're here, Preston. We will catch you guys, and we'll bring Preston back for a deeper conversation. You're not going to want to miss this next one, because I, Josh, am going to tell 3 stories about background checks, and a couple of them are a little funny. One of them is extraordinarily serious. All right, gang, we're grateful that you're here. We'll catch you guys on the next one.